Fiona. Thanks everyone for coming. Welcome. So we're going to be talking today about system change, what that means for us, because we know that it can mean a lot of different things to different people. We're going to talk a bit about how we think that can put into practice, how funders can target their resources to more kind of radical aims, I guess. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen with the presentation slides.
So we do quick intros while we get the deck up.
Yeah. Do you want to introduce yourself, Beth?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So hi everybody. So lovely to have so many people here. It's always fantastic that so many people want to come and talk about how we might better make systemic change. My name's Beth. I am Associate Director of Place and Systemic Change at Renaisi. Yeah, I'm just really looking forward to talking to everyone about that today. Thank you. Back to you.
Okay. Yeah. So as I'm Kiran. I'm Head of Policy at Women's Resource Centre. For those of you that don't know, Women's Resource Centre is a second-tier organisation. We represent the women's sector, which is made up of lots of women's organisations across the UK. So that can be anything from domestic violence refuges to rape crisis centres to kind of grassroots organisations who were supporting Black and minoritized women, disabled women on a massive kind of array of issues. So anything from addiction, training, employment support, immigration support, mental health. And yeah, the sector has a very, very rich history, and it's often been at the forefront of a lot of social and legal changes, such as criminalising rape in marriage, legalising, decriminalising abortion. It's really shone a spotlight on violence against women and girls, the kind of dynamics of interpersonal violence, and this kind of bigger agenda to kind of shift public attitudes and kind of change the way the system works for women has always been a really important part of the women's sector. So we can kind of reasonably call that system change work. But yeah, over the years, that's become more and more difficult to do. So I also want to talk a bit in this session about why that is and what we can do about it. So, oh yeah, there we go. So yeah, funders have been really kind of big on funding system change work in recent years. Why is that? What's brought this about? I just want to throw three things out there. You might have some other ideas. First of all, I think there's been a recognition of the need to do more than just firefighting and picking up the pieces kind of work. And that's become even more acute because we have been in a deepening social crisis for the last kind of 10 years. And we've seen demand increasing and kind of pots of money seem to be shrinking as well at the same time. And in the case of the women's sector, a lot more women are turning up with more complex needs, which means that they're not just coming with like one issue. So they're not just kind of coming to the refuge wanting to escape an abusive relationship, but they might also have no recourse to public funds. They might have kind of immigration issues. They might turn up and want employment support, but they've also got very acute mental health issues. So it's just becoming a bit more of a complicated and more burdensome kind of picture in terms of service delivery. And there have been more emergency pots of money, and we saw that a lot, especially during COVID. And that's really needed, and it was, really appreciated. But it's just become increasingly obvious that we can't be in crisis mode all the time. And it has just been this constant crisis mode, and we kind of need to look at the sources of the increased demand at the same time, because otherwise it's just not sustainable. The second point is, we've had all of these bigger social movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too, and those movements are very important in shining a light on kind of institutional racism, sexism, and inequality has gotten worse. And so I know there's been very high profile cases as well with the police and stuff. So this idea that we need to have fundamental reform of criminal justice system, health system, government, even our own kind of democratic practices, it's kind of on the table. And thirdly, I think people that are working in the sector are also facing a bit of a brick wall. So like with women working in women's organisations, we've got a very kind of dedicated staff, but a lot of them carried on working during COVID. There's a lot of staff burnout and issues with well-being. Paying conditions aren't necessarily the best because the funding situation is so bad. And I think at some point you kind of start questioning, okay, like all of this effort that we're putting in, we're not really seeing any payoff. The social crisis is getting worse. And I think all of that kind of possibly pushes people in a more radical direction. Okay. So, okay, great. Funding system changes on the funders' agenda. We all kind of understand that the systems need to change. Funders are now kind of funding more organisations that say they're doing system change work. So, what's the problem? Can't we just get on with it? I think there's a feeling that even though organisations who say that they're demonstrating system change work are being funded, that isn't necessarily having the impact that we would have hoped. And there's various kind of underlying reasons for this. So for the women's sector, for example, one of them is this kind of chronic underfunding that has been going on for years and years and years. And also this kind of competitive commissioning environment has meant this constant survival mode, and it's pushed organisations to put more energy and resources into kind of frontline service delivery over and above maybe more radical campaigning work. There's also, I think, maybe a bit of a fuzzy and simplistic idea of what system change means. So kind of any generic organisation could, probably claim that they could do system change work just because, they're kind of delivering services to a specific group of people that might be kind of otherwise marginalised, but they don't necessarily have a kind of wider analysis of like, kind of oppression and inequality and why that persists, and what kind of work they're doing to address those bigger questions. And if the funder also doesn't kind of have the answer or kind of an understanding of those questions, then it's a bit like, oh well, everything goes and every organisation can say they're doing system change work, and a lot of the radical potential is lost. And then another kind of obvious factor is that a lot of organisations' kind of relationship to kind of funders in the state has changed. There's more funding precarity, and that's just meant an environment where it's a bit more unlikely that organisations want to rock the boat. I think there's also a danger that big ideas like system change can turn into a tick box exercise. And the funding system itself, so the bidding tendering process, can lend itself to that kind of simplification. So for example, funders that want to deliver services, they want to fund services for kind of led by and for organisations. They might ask on the application form, okay, so what groups are you led by and for? And they'll have like all the categories. And so for the Propel Fund, for example, there's kind of an equity partners group that are kind of looking at that, and basically they can see on their radar that lots of organisations are maybe just ticking all of those categories. Because they're kind of not sure, it's not necessarily being double checked or kind of clarified because the definitions aren't kind of understood and set down by everyone. So there's a lot of kind of uncertainty over what even constitutes a led by and for organisation, so that needs to be addressed. Beth, shall I hand over to you now?
Thank you. Yes, I think all of this exists in the context of what you're trying to do is introduce system change, which is fundamentally a new way of working, and we'll go on to talk about that in a minute. And you're trying to introduce it into an existing system and traditional models of funding that people are used to working with. And so people are very used to ticking boxes. And, as Kiran rightly said, because we've got this competitive commissioning environment, we've got a situation where we're very used to mission creep from delivery organisations because they want to secure funding. And, so they'll say, yes, of course we can deliver this. Yes, we can do that because actually it helps sort of pull in pots of money. But actually, when you're looking at systems change, and this is not the fault of anybody except the existing system, actually people will say, yes, yeah, absolutely, we can do that. But it makes it a bit difficult down the road. And what we're seeing now in our work as Renaisi, so we work with a lot of different funders and delivery organisations, charities, local authorities, in kind of trying to introduce systems change to their ways of working. Actually, a lot of them are now coming back and saying, oh, well, we really thought that this organisation was pitching something that was a bit more systemic, but actually what we're now seeing is they really needed the funding for delivery. So there is this real challenge that we're trying to introduce something into an existing system, which is one of real precarity when it comes to funding. So just to kind of elaborate on that tick box point a bit, there's also challenges around interpretation. Systems change means lots of different things to lots of different people. Lots of people see it as that kind of ecosystem piece and the kind of connections, complexity, interconnection piece. That can sometimes be a little bit alienating, but it also can sometimes be really helpful in the sense of grounding things in relationships and the fact that things change very relationally. And then also there's a view on systems change, which I think is the one that Kiran and I'll be talking a bit more to today, around seeing underneath the surface. So there's views that kind of say, well, actually, let's sort of focus on collaboration, let's join the dots, let's work more connectedly. And that's really, really important. And then there's also that importance of seeing, under the surface, and looking at kind of what are the things that are holding the system in place that cause harm, and what are those mental models, difficult belief systems, all of those things. So I think that because people interpret systems change in lots of different ways, it can make it very, very hard to fund, because when you say we want to fund a systemic piece of work, actually that means different things to different people. And obviously the same in terms of implementation. So again, because we're trying to bring a completely different way of working into an existing structure and system, what we're trying to do is bring a more connected, deep, challenging, radical way of working. And that really comes up against organisations' timelines, organisational agendas, which we have to be honest that we do all have, because we do all have to pay our bills, we do all have to pay our staff. So we're trying to bring in this very different way of working into kind of business as usual. And that can lead to a real challenge of implementation and a real issue where actually we'd like to work in one way, but our existing structures and systems prescribe that we need to do things a certain way. So that's just another challenge that we really come up against when we're thinking about funding systemic change.
Okay. Next slide. We just wanted to very briefly kind of mention the context in which we're talking about system change. So yeah, the women's sector is in a funding crisis. NCVO did some research recently on how much the VCS is subsidising public sector contracts, sometimes up to 40%. Commissioning has essentially become a bit of a closed shop with very high barriers of entry. We've got post-COVID inflationary and demand pressures. The political climate is quite hostile to a lot of social demands and critical voices. There's the impact of not wanting to bite the hand that feeds. And yeah, as we said, the kind of urgent social situation is lending itself more to kind of funding frontline work over collective work. And so, yeah, that's maybe, not so immediate and longer term. Did you want to say something, Beth, on this one?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a bit about the funding crisis. I think it's really helpful to kind of to set that out. And I worry this is something that we're not actually talking about enough. And it feels to me that, without wanting to put too fine a point on it, we're really seeing at the moment this real squeeze. We're seeing a lot of redundancies across the social sector. We're seeing a lot of organisations folding. And it's really clear that actually trying to introduce something new in the context of, such an extreme funding crisis across the sector and such a crisis in the stability of the sector is really, really hard. And I think it's important to just recognise that.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so we're going to kind of split a bit. So I'm going to talk a bit about Women's Resource Centre's ideas about system change, and then I'll hand over to Beth and she'll talk a bit about Renaisi's ideas. So for many of us in the women's voluntary community sector, our historical development from the feminist movement has given us certain principles and an analysis of power that gives us a grounding and theory of change and practice, which may be helpful for this discussion. So the following is what WRC uses, and it's from the work of Patricia Hill Collins, who's a Black feminist scholar. So she talks about these four kind of levels that are all really
Your
fundamental.
half an hour's up, Dylan, but you can have the end of this match and then maybe something else.
Is that a comment to us, or just anyway, I'll carry on. Okay. So yeah, these kind of four levels are really important when we're thinking about system change work. So the first is interpersonal. So this is about changes in skills, knowledge, and individual consciousness, if you like, of women, to kind of understand their everyday lived experiences. And the kind of normal service delivery model might kind of fail to capture this really important aspect of personal growth, healing, and that's kind of facilitated in the women's sector by having women-only spaces, a lot of group work, collective work, but also there is a political agenda in there that tries to kind of challenge this individualized explanation of bad personal experiences, for example, through personal psychology, and maybe talking a bit more about the structural understanding of, patriarchy, sexism, gender relations, these kind of bigger systems. And I think, without this kind of bit more broader analysis, that structural change is less likely to happen. So if you always think, if you approach an organization and they offer a service and you do that, and it's a very kind of, oh yeah, so they've given me something and I might feel better. But if there's no kind of bigger kind of analysis of maybe your situation is not actually that different from a lot of people, and why is that kind of broader thing, I think, is that happens quite a lot in women's organizations, or at least that's the aim, to kind of take it from the individual to a more kind of broader understanding and analysis of like, why is this happening to us on a bigger scale. The second level is community or hegemonic. So this is about being able to put this changed consciousness into some kind of practical use. So women's organizations often provide a space or a platform for women to come together, make their voices heard, and try and encourage active participation, either within the aims of or campaigns of the organization, or in the community or civil society. And often that work challenges hegemonic narratives that seek to demonize or victim blame the poorest and the most vulnerable. So this kind of step towards individual to solidarity building, I think, is really important for the development of a bigger social movement that struggles for social change. And I think, women's organisations have always felt they have a role in nurturing this kind of relationship. The third level is organisational or disciplinary. So this is about how organisational and institutional practices and processes reproduce certain unequal power relations. So, for example, the divide between those organisations that hold the money and those who receive it is one example where power imbalances continue, which has a kind of disciplining effect. So, that kind of means maybe we should be investigating different funding models that break down the barriers between funders and funded, so we don't fear biting the hand that feeds. And I think within organisations as well, the kind of professionalisation of the voluntary community sector has maybe played a bit of a role in also stifling our ability to maintain systems change work. And lastly, we've got structural or statutory. So this is a critique of state and social policies, laws and institutions that regulate our lives and decisions. So if we're serious about challenging oppression, we also need to understand the role that these laws and statutory agencies and institutions play in reproducing oppression and keeping us divided. So yeah, I think we kind of need to take all of those levels into account when we're thinking about system change, and kind of use it to think about where we target our resources and our work, and also thinking a bit kind of more strategically and kind of like kind of in a broader way about where we want to go and how we get there. So I just want to give 3 very quick examples of organisations within the women's sector that we think are doing systems change work. So one of them yeah, you probably heard of Southall Black Sisters, and they've been around for a very long time, but they do a lot of casework and, you know, kind of frontline service delivery work, but they also have a very long running campaign on kind of no recourse to public funds, and kind of challenging this idea that like some women are kind of deserving of help and support if they're fleeing a violent relationship, and others not. They've also challenged local council funding decisions and misapplication of the law in terms of funding specialist services. They're also very kind of good at using their service users as then campaigners to kind of push those campaign demands. Secondly, there's the Latin American Women's Rights Service. So they provide kind of frontline service kind of advice and counselling for women. They've also had a campaign around a firewall between the police and Home Office. So when women are disclosing violence to the police, their information is being passed on to the Home Office, and then there's a threat of deportation, and that's obviously a massive deterrent for women coming forward. And both of these organisations are working on kind of issues and demands that are very politically unpopular, you know, like it's a very kind of anti-immigration kind of political environment in general. But yeah, they're really kind of plugging away at that. And lastly, I just want to mention the London VAW Consortium, which is the London Violence Against Women and Girls Consortium. So this is it's made up of kind of, I think, 28 women's organisations across London, and they came together as a consortium in response to this kind of a competitive commissioning environment, because there is this kind of tendency of the funding system to reward bigger generic organisations who are able to deliver services across the whole of London. Obviously, for a small women's organisation, you know, you're not going to be able to do that. So working in a collective, more collective way was a very good response to that, but it was also a way to like level the playing field between women's organisations, like the bigger and smaller ones. And it also is a framework in which to develop processes of work that are more progressive. So, for example, all of them have signed up to the Anti-Racism Charter, which is about how do you work together that in ways that don't penalise smaller specialist organisations over bigger ones. So yeah, what basic elements do we need to drive system change work? We think, firstly, some level of financial independence. 2, long-term financial sustainability for strategic planning, instead of kind of piecemeal pots of money, which is how it kind of is at the moment. We need more forums for radical discussions and proposals, and more second-tier capacity, we think, to push forward debate, coordinate different groups, and drive collective work. Okay, so Beth, I'll pass over to you.
Thanks so much. And I think it's, you know, it's so helpful to sort of ground us in actually what we think we need to do and what we think needs to be different. So as Renaisi, we spent the past year running an inquiry into what it takes to change the system. And we've done that in partnership with lots of different organisations that we work with. Across lots of different sectors, youth sector, women's sector, across equity issues, lots of different things. And what we've grappled with is the fact that actually it's not helpful when we think about systems change to say, okay, well, here's a framework and here's A plus B equals C, because that can be quite reductive and quite minimising. But equally, it's also really helpful to have a bit of a place to start. So that's what we've tried to pull together based on our inquiry over the past year, is actually if you're an organisation that wants to start to fund in this way, that wants to start to work in this way, that wants to start to partner in this way, what are the different things that you might do and where might you start? And we have developed a sort of a five action model, which looks at 5 different things that we think we need to do, and all on basis, drawn from learning from organisations who are kind of at different parts of their journeys at the moment. And so those different stages are thinking about the self, building coalition, building your understanding, challenging and embedding new mental models, and then embedding the change that you've just made. And on the next slide, I will talk through this a bit further. We just jump to the next slide, if that's all right. That's great, thank you. So what we've really learned in terms of a starting point for this, originally when we launched our inquiry, we thought, let's start by understanding the system. Let's start by really understanding who's in the system, what's going on, what is the system around the person at the centre of any given issue. And what we ultimately realised through that year was that understanding of the system will be shaped by who's in the room at that moment. So what we realised is we needed to cycle back, and I think this speaks to some of what Kiran was talking about, to actually really starting to think about the self level. So to think about the person and the organisation who is starting to think about this change. So to really interrogate what you're bringing to it, the voices that you have around your table as an organisation, who is missing, who are you not hearing from, and what's your own role in the system in terms of what is the power that you hold. And really starting by interrogating that, because we realised that without starting at that point, what you might do is design and deliver a funding for systemic change, but that actually centres one particular set of voices. And actually, if you brought that kind of understanding the system bit sort of a bit further into the journey and actually started with understanding yourself, it would help you to think about that at the early stage. So we really think it's sort of starting with that point of what power do we hold in the system? What are we driving? What are we shaping? What do we need to interrogate about ourselves? And hopefully in that process, we can start to think about changing whose voices are heard and who needs to be involved from the very beginning stage in order to actually think about any kind of meaningful systemic change. And from there, we then think it's useful to start to think about building a coalition. And this might be a coalition around shared ambition for change. And what we think is really important within this is empathetic and intentional relationships. So actually, while it's very, very hard to not go in with an organisational agenda, there really is something about multiple people in a coalition really trying to understand collectively the problem, the lens that different people are approaching it from, and how they might address it. Just jump back to the previous slide, if that's all right. I think we just jumped on one. Thank you. And we think it's often really useful to loop back. So we don't think that understanding of the self stops. We sort of think, great, right, we've done that, let's move on. It's constantly about, when we're moving into coalition, well, what power are we bringing to this coalition? Where might that be a bit uncomfortable? What do we need to challenge? What do we need to address? Whose voices are still missing within that coalition? So at each stage, it's bringing that stage with you. And then following that, we then think it's understanding the system together. So coming together with your coalition where you've done the work to understand yourself, where you're starting to think about the power and some of the challenges that you might bring to the system, to think together about what that system looks like. So what are the results and patterns that the system is producing? So we know that the outcomes that we see are the results of the patterns that the system is producing. So actually, what are those? Let's call those out. And what are the power structures and the relationship? Who is holding power in particular systems? And often that might be connected to the kind of what results are being driven, but really starting to unpick those things so that when we're actually thinking about pulling a system apart and really unpicking it, we know all of the different things that are driving the production of outcomes at the end of it. And we know what those power structures are that might need shifting and changing and unpicking. And again, this is really about kind of having those shared processes for listening, learning, and iterating together. Following that, we think it's really important to test mental models. So to check assumptions, to really dive into those mental models that are sitting underneath the surface of a system and are not often driving the outcomes that a system is producing. They can often be really, really uncomfortable, and they can be things that we've just accepted as a society that actually we might want to challenge and change what we accept as normal. And what we hypothesize is that in that changing what we accept as normal, that is how we can start to redesign a system that drives different outcomes and that produces different solutions together. but that also is designed to not embed some of those harms that exist in existing systems, whether those are, systems around women, whether those systems around young people, or lots of different types of inequity, and lots of different types of discrimination, racism, abuse, all of those different things that we might just need to unpick, or that we do need to unpick in order to change our mental models and to change as a society what we hold to be acceptable and normal. And then from there, we think that we can start to redesign those things and to rethink what those things look like. So we can then start to change some of the practicalities that sit underneath that. That might be perceptions of risk, because perceptions of risk as we fund traditionally harm much smaller organisations who are often led by the people that they're designed to serve, but because they're much smaller organisations, they often carry a lot more risk and therefore are less likely to be funded. So thinking about all of the kind of practicalities, what are the incentive structures, what do the funding flows look like? Once we've kind of unearthed and changed those mental models, we can start to think about the practicalities that would drive and would create a new system. And fundamentally, as we go through that process, it's really important that we continually invest in this change. So it's not a great, right, we've done that now. It's actually this kind of thinking will continue to need to be done. And then it's really important for us to say that actually this doesn't stop. So this is a loop. So, it's very difficult to kind of have a one-off systems change initiative and then to see it as being done, because actually in trying to shift a system, what we've often noticed is that there will, of course, be unintended consequences, that we will, of course, not have heard all the voices that we wanted to. And so it is really, really important that we're constantly going around this loop thinking who is not being heard, who is holding power, how might we want to shift power in order to create kind of a better environment, a better society, better outcomes for the people that we're trying to work with and for. So it feels like it's very much a constant loop, and that's how we would propose to go through it. I should say for Renaisi, this is very much a learning journey. So we don't sort of see this as oh great, right, we've done our model, let's move on. It's very much actually this is what we think based on a year's deep learning on this, and based on our learning on it sort of over the past sort of 5 years as well. But actually, how do we continue to learn as we work with organisations who are putting this into practice? And I just wanted to quickly touch, before we move into breakout groups, I quickly wanted to touch on some of the current issues that I'm seeing in funding systemic change. So one of those is how we talk about systemic change. I think sometimes the language of systemic change can feel quite prohibitive or exclusionary, and there's lots of different schools of thought on whether it's actually a helpful term. And so I think that sometimes we shy away from using it, but then we're expecting people to actually do a really deep and systemic piece of work, and those two things don't marry up. So we really need to grapple with actually when we are having a conversation with a group of people, with our partners, with those that we're trying to make change alongside and with, actually how do we talk about that, and how do we develop a shared understanding? And it almost doesn't matter what the language that we use is, but that understanding needs to be shared. And I think it's easy to shy away from that, but it really causes problems down the line if we're not on the same page. And then there's also, I think, challenges around who starts the journey. It's almost like actually as a funder, how do people feel about coming and saying, well, actually, this is the change that we want to drive, this is the change that we want to create. And that can also feel like it introduces a power dynamic. So there's just something about grappling with that. I think at the start of the journey, it's really about looking at who's part of starting that journey with you, because actually there is likely to be a huge amount of existing thought and existing organisations, larger grassroots organisations who are thinking about this. So actually, how do we come alongside those who might have already started the journey? Another big thing I'm seeing at the moment is a thing around storming, norming, and forming. So I really wanted to point to this, that actually a really common thing seems to be that when partnerships are being funded to drive systemic change, often the partnerships can fall apart pretty catastrophically, or there can be significant disagreement, new partners coming around the table, some partners leaving the table. And that feels so uncomfortable for funders that we come on side when we're the learning partner. Because obviously that's not what you're funding for. You're not funding for people to disagree. You're not funding for, for people to blow it all up. And actually you're sort of thinking, well, this isn't the sort of trajectory that we set out. But it's pretty inevitable. And I think we need to be okay with that. And it's pretty inevitable because we're dealing with incredibly emotive issues, and people will be at different stages on those journey and have their differing and very strong beliefs. So it's something to expect and to perhaps build in time for. And I think if we all service it and we all know it's going to happen, then it's going to feel a little bit more comfortable. And then there's also a piece around, what it looks like when we need to align with organizational agendas, budgets, timeframes. We can't pretend that we don't exist in the world that we do exist in. And that's really, really hard when you're trying to make change that can feel really emergent, that can really needs to kind of go with beliefs and energy, and really needs to kind of be done in a very intentional and thoughtful and understanding way. It can be really difficult to kind of have an agenda on top of that, or have a time frame, have a board that makes a decision on top of that. That can all feel really uncomfortable. So we just need to grapple with it, and I think be honest with it and surface it. We're not working in an ideal world here. And then finally, I think there really is something about learning and resilience. And I think we are, we're a reasonable way into systemic change being, a way of working that a lot of people are trying and are using in the social sector. And I think it can be very demoralizing when at kind of the end of that arc that I just talked through, people think, oh my goodness, but actually there's still so much that we could have done differently, or there's still so many problems, or actually we tried to do this, but this actually really re-embedded another really harmful power structure. And I think it's really important to call that out and to say that is going to happen. That's part of it. We're not going to design a new perfect system overnight. All we're doing is trying to unpick the current system and trying to put some new things in place and to kind of to seed a new one. And so there are going to be things that go wrong, and all we can do is kind of be resilient to it, to continue funding in this way and to continue learning as best we can. So I wanted to point to those things as well, in case those are things that people are grappling with at the moment. And then sort of for the next, let's say 15 minutes, what we really wanted to do is to go into breakout groups and to hear a bit from yourselves. So to think a bit about what resonates for you about the approaches to systems change that we've shared, and what haven't we considered? Like what haven't Kiran and I talked about today that actually you think, you know what, but I think it's really this. I think this is really important. And also what might be holding us back. So it'd be great if we can spend 15 minutes in groups walking through those things and just, sharing some reflections, and then we'll come back together shortly before the end.
Hi, Leona and Sarah. If you can hear me, we are joining breakout rooms now. So if you could just click yes to the breakout room you've been invited to. Hi, Leona. I'm guessing you want your iPhone to be in the same room as your other device. You should be in that room. Oh, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Could you send me, sorry, I've got multiple devices going on. Could you put me in room 2, please?
As that one? Yeah. Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Button.
Okay, are we all back? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we've only got 4 minutes left. I just thought we would. How many groups did we have in the end? As the break? Were there 3?
We had 4 groups.
Okay. I don't know whether we want to just do a quick 30-second. How was your discussion? I mean, ours was good. Obviously, there's not really much kind of time, but we did exchange email addresses so we can continue the conversation. Just a couple of points that I noted down. So somebody mentioned that, you know, this idea of relational and intentional relationships is, we definitely need it, but it's always like peeling the onion, you know, or there was a wound analogy that you go and try and sort it out, but then it kind of gets deeper and deeper, and then you kind of end up opening a bit of a Pandora's box. And then what do you do in that situation? Like, is there the flexibility, I guess, from funders to be able to like carry on that journey? And I think that's really tied to then kind of, you know, the funding model of, well, we're only going to give money for 2 years or 3 years, but then, you know, this is like a kind of has to go on forever. So is the funding kind of matching the kind of practice needed to deal with that social issue, which is kind of always way bigger than you think it's going to be. Yeah, you know, that we kind of need to have a bit more of a solution focused conversation. The importance of collaboration, how we need to be more organizationally led, and that's not just about money, but also how do we share knowledge and contacts. We talked a bit more about the London Vault Consortium as a good example of a kind of working concrete example of trying to change the system, but actually having the space to do that ourselves and set ourselves up into a structure that then is a challenge to the current funding model. And yeah, the importance of maybe distilling research and knowledge and information that lots of organizations have into kind of succinct practical things that then we can operationalize. And Naz mentioned her organization developing kind of different ways of doing that, which don't have so much burden on the small organization. Okay, anybody else?
I can jump in very quickly from our group. We had a really good conversation around kind of what you're resourcing as a funder when you're funding systemic change. You know, is it just a lot of people's time, which often it feels like it is. And then we also had a conversation about sort of some of the common kind of pitfalls and some of the common big challenges, and just sort of elaborated on the ones that we talked about in the session. If anybody else wants to jump in, I'm conscious we've got 1 minute left.
I think very briefly, one of the things we talked about was it's helpful to talk through kind of examples we've seen of systems change rather than kind of getting into sort of rabbit holes of trying to define it. Yeah, really focusing on where we've seen it, and that makes it easier to recognize it.
Okay, anybody else from the other group? I mean, if not, we've kind of run out of time anyway. But anyway, I've posted in the chat a kind of briefing that we wrote about system change. So you're more than welcome to have a look at that. That's on our website. And yeah, it's very short for such a kind of massive topic. But yeah, I don't know whether there's any place that we can maybe collect these examples of organizations that we think are doing systems change, because yeah, you're right, this kind of practical I mean, I kind of mentioned 3, but yeah, I could have probably spent a whole hour really kind of going into that. Actually, maybe that would have been a better presentation. Anyway, next time.
I wonder if London funders wanted to just ask, you know, maybe those of us that know some models or some people that have been doing stuff, you know, like I shared an example in that we've been doing in Pet and Urban Health in my group, and I'm just, you know, like a couple of organizations that have helped us to do that work. Really happy to share. Melanie, could you, you know, I could send it to you, or maybe just email all of us, and if as all of us, and if we know things that we reply all or something, I don't know,
Yeah.
you'll figure out a way.
Yeah. No, please send it to me. We are going to be writing up a festival report, kind of all those 5 themes that the festival is focusing on. So we can absolutely include case studies in that. Please send them my way. The next focus for our learning program will actually be on systemic change. So we're kind of going to be drawing out lots of learning points from this session and from other conversations during the festival. So we are definitely kind of picking up this topic at London Funders post-festival and continuing the conversation. So yeah, please send anything you want my way. Hope you have my email, but if not, we will circulate it. And yeah, just thank you so much, Beth and Kiran. I feel like this has been such a useful kind of starting point for a lot of us, and really helpful to sort of try and synthesize some of all this very complex stuff. So thank you, and thank you to everyone who's joined as well. And yeah, hopefully see you at other festival sessions during the week. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.